Welcome to Midweek Mysteries, and thank you all for being here. I'm your host, Nick Ryan. If you're new to the show, Midweek Mysteries is a shorter version of our full-length Sunday episodes, where we also enjoy giving a personal shout-out to our newest supporters, so please be sure to tune in. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can become a patron at patreon.com/Paranormal Mysteries. Or if you'd prefer to make a one-time donation, please visit buymeacoffee.com/paranormal. And as always, subscribing to the podcast and sharing it with your friends is one of the best ways to show your support, and we definitely appreciate it. Now let's see what today's storytellers have to say. Today's first midweek mystery comes to us from Cameron. Cameron's story is called Uninvited Guest. Cameron says, in 2013, I was living in Brazil as a service missionary for my church. It was interesting to listen to the countless stories of the Brazilian people receiving and experiencing all kinds of paranormal visitations, which they were very open about sharing. At the time, I was living in a small one-bedroom apartment with a close friend and fellow missionary named Phil. One specific day, we had a lunch appointment set up with some friends of ours, but we had some time to kill before we had to leave. We decided to lay down for a bit before taking off. While we were relaxing, I ended up dozing off into a light sleep. I began to dream one of those peculiar dreams where it feels as though you are living your day like normal. I kept dreaming that it was time to leave, but every time I checked the alarm clock next to my bed, it was showing a different time. Becoming quite frustrated, I climbed out of my bed and went out to our small kitchen, where we had a microwave with a clock. Surely, the time in the microwave would be correct. At this point, I did not realize that I was still dreaming, and the clock on the microwave began to flicker, while an eerie sensation took over my whole body. Chills ran up and down my spine, and I was overcome with a terrible headache. I remember looking over into the corner of the room and seeing a dark figure whose presence was most terrifying, and definitely uninvited. This experience was enough to really wake me up out of this nightmare. As I lay in bed awake, my headache remained, and I was unable to open my eyes. I felt as though there was a heavy weight on the right side of my body holding it down to prevent me from getting up. I have heard stories of sleep paralysis, but very rarely does it affect only half of one's body. Even though I was being held down, it seemed like someone or something was trying to push me off of the bed. Suddenly, the alarm that Phil and I had set before laying down went off. We left our house and went out to our lunch appointment. For about an hour I had noticed that Phil was acting a little strange and was saying very little. I asked him if he was doing all right, and he responded by sharing something that had happened to him while we were napping. He told me that while we laid there, he couldn't open his eyes and was unable to move the left side of his body. I was in shock. Hearing this story, it dawned on me that what had happened was more than my imagination. He had experienced the exact same thing at the exact same time. I realized that since I couldn't move my right side, and he couldn't move his left, that whatever was in our room that day was standing between our beds. Our next story of the night comes from Danny. Danny's story is called Goodbye. Danny says, when I was 24, my father passed away. This was extremely hard on me, because growing up, I don't remember him being sick or having many medical problems. I had reached the age where our relationship had finally changed from being a father and son to being more like good friends. I often think back and smile, thinking how close we became between the time I was 16 and 23. When my father first got sick, it was extremely hard on the whole family. The hospital he was in was the VA hospital, 4 hours away. That made it hard to be there for him, especially since he was in and out of the hospital for the last 6 months of his life. Just as well, he went through a number of surgeries. The last 4 months he wasn't able to come home. For part of that time, I was able to rent my mom an apartment there so she could be there for him. Eventually, she had to give that up and move back home for financial reasons. The hardest part of the whole ordeal was when he passed away. He was alone. We weren't able to be there with him to say goodbye. In the following months after his death, My mom, my sister, and I each had experiences where my father appeared to us. We all lived in the same house. My sister was the owner. It was divided into 2 apartments. I lived in the upstairs apartment, and my mom lived in the downstairs with my sister. Mom's room was in the front of the house. She had several windows that faced the street. She didn't drive, so Dad's car sat in front of the house for several months, until we were able to sell it. On more than one occasion, my mom told me that she saw my dad sitting in the car. My sister was home alone one day, doing her normal house cleaning, while her husband was at work and the kids were at school. She suddenly had a feeling that she wasn't alone. She looked up and saw Dad standing in the doorway between the kitchen and dining room, smiling at her. On another occasion, her whole family was in the living room watching TV one night, and there was a large mirror on the wall over the fireplace. It didn't exactly fall, but it slowly slid down the wall, over the mantel and onto the floor. It came to a rest in front of the fireplace, without as much as a chip to the mirror. My own experience was slightly different. It came in the form of a dream. In my dream, I found myself walking down the street in a downtown area that did not seem familiar. There was a row of storefronts I was walking by when I came across my dad, standing in the doorway of one of the stores. He was leaning against the doorframe and smiling at me. I stopped and asked him how he was. He told me he was doing good, and to not worry about him. You may think this was just a dream, but this was the most vivid dream I have ever had. I am writing this over 40 years after I had had it, and I remember it as clear as if it was from last night's awakening. I'm convinced this was his way of telling each of us goodbye, in a way that would be meaningful to each of us. Thanks, Danny. Our next story of the night comes from Prashant. Prashant's story is called My Possessed Friend. Prashant says, Hello, Nick. I am your listener all the way from India. I discovered your podcast last year and loving it ever since. The story I'm about to tell you is an incident that happened to one of my college friends, who I will refer to as R, as it'll be easier for you to pronounce. Although I wasn't present myself when this happened, it has been described to me by my other colleagues who were present at the time. It happened back in 2018 when my friend R and his roommate had one friend staying the night at their rented apartment. It was late at night, and R was sleeping for quite some time, and the other 2 were on their phone, checking social media, having a conversation, etc. Suddenly, R, who was sleeping until now, got in a weird position. He was sitting on his knees with his upper body bowed forward, his head touching the mattress, like a praying position of a Muslim, except that he wasn't praying, and isn't Muslim either. They saw him, and his eyes were still closed. They thought maybe he was still sleeping, and didn't think much of it. They asked him, Hey, what happened? Why are you sitting? They repeated the question, but R wasn't responding. After being in the position for a couple of minutes, he slowly began to sit up straight and opened his eyes. When they saw him, he had his eyes rolled up with his pupils hardly visible, and it scared the crap out of both of them. They were still asking him, What happened? Are you okay? But he still didn't reply. Then he started talking in an unfamiliar voice. He had a change in his tone, and his voice was hoarse. He was talking about things that none of them had any idea about. He was telling weird things about people they didn't know, not even himself. Then, R, who was still sitting in the same position, said repeatedly in an exasperated manner, I am hungry, and shouted at them to make food. Both of them were petrified, and it was past midnight, so there was no point in going out of the apartment, so they just did whatever he asked. Having no idea what they were going to make, they went to the kitchen and kept chopping onions and veggies. They were doing anything to stay out of the room. Eventually, they prepared some noodles for him. They were very hesitant and frightened to go into the room again. When they came back, they found R sleeping again in a normal position. They tried to wake him by calling his name and tapping on his shoulder gently. When he got up, he was normal again. He was rather pissed at them for waking him up from his sleep. They told him what had happened, but he had no idea about any of it. He didn't know anything about the things that he was babbling about when in that state. Initially, I didn't think it was true when they first told me about it until it happened once again after a few months, in the middle of the day. This time, his eyes were not rolled up, but his voice and his tone were still different. He even went out of the apartment in that state. He came back after some time and was normal again. An eerie thing was that after the second incident, there was a weird stink in the apartment near his bed for about a week. It was a weird smell, unlike anything, and was only limited to a particular part of the room. They searched if any dead animal was there, or maybe there was spoiled food somewhere, but there wasn't anything. Thankfully, that was the last time that it happened. Since then, we have stayed at his place several times, but nothing happened. R didn't have any history of mental sickness or medical record of such sort. He doesn't sleepwalk or sleep talk either, so whatever happened was very creepy, and I felt like it was worth sharing. These kind of possessions aren't very rare over here. I have seen a few myself, but people think of them mostly as psychological or some mental issue, but I am not always completely satisfied with that explanation. Sorry if this was long. Love from India. Our next midweek mystery comes to us from Christy. Christy's story is called The Experience That Made Me Believe. Christy says, I moved into a tiny 2-bedroom house with my 2 girls, who were 18 months and 3. My mother's husband knew the man who owned the house, as his daughter had lived there many years previously. I didn't believe in spirits at the time, but the house gave me a weird feeling. When we moved in for the first 2 or 3 nights, I slept with the light on because I felt like someone was watching me. Quite a few years before my stepsister lived there, it was converted into a daycare, so there were square holes cut into the walls, so they were able to watch the kids from the window, no matter what room they were in. I felt really silly to have the light on, so after a few nights I told myself I was being crazy, and turned the light off. After about a week of living in the house, my 3-year-old ran out of her bedroom into the living room, and told me that a little boy had gone into her wardrobe. I went to check, and there was no one there, and it startled me, but she did have a crazy imagination, so I put it down to her just being silly. A few times I would walk out of my room and think someone would be in the kitchen, which I could see through the hole in the wall. It was like when you think you see something in the corner of your eye and turn to look and it's not there. This went on for months, and I continued to tell myself that it was just a shadow or nothing at all. One night I woke up suddenly, not sure what woke me, but I thought I saw someone standing over my daughter's crib. It was only for a second, and then it was gone, and I convinced myself that I must not have been completely awake, or that it was a dream. Little weird things would happen from time to time that would make me question whether I was experiencing something paranormal, but I kept telling myself it was all in my head. Some days, things would be moved. I knew for sure I had put something somewhere, and it would be in a different place. My brother's girlfriend had borrowed my car and got a speed camera fine, which came in the mail. I had put it on my fridge with magnets to give to her to pay, and I came in twice in a couple of days to find it sitting on the kitchen table, which was out of reach for it to just blow off in a breeze. My youngest daughter was having night terrors, and would start screaming in her sleep, often saying, "Leave me alone and don't touch me." I decided it was nightmares, and it didn't really start until I met my now husband. Once he started staying over, things started getting intense. One night I woke up to what I thought was Steve standing in the doorway of my room. I asked him what he was doing, and he didn't reply, so I started to think he was sleepwalking. So in a louder voice, I said, "Steve, what are you doing? Come back to bed." At that moment, Steve moved in the bed beside me, so thinking it was an intruder, I quickly jumped up to flick on the light, and nobody was there. Steve woke up, to me in a panic, and thought I was losing my mind. It happened over and over again, where I would wake to find someone standing in my doorway. Steve was starting to get concerned how often it was happening, and he did not believe in spirits at all. That was until one night when he was discussing the possibility of getting the house blessed, even if it was just to ease my mind on what had been happening. I asked him to stop discussing it because I felt uncomfortable talking about it in the house, in case it was real, and it angered them. We were laying in bed facing the doorway, and at the exact same time, we both jumped. I said to him, "Oh my God, what did you just see?" He said, "I just saw a flash of light, but I had seen a full figure run out of my daughter's room, past my doorway, like they were in a hurry." Steve jumped out of bed and turned on lights, and no one was there. He finally started to believe that something was going on, and I finally had my realization that this was not a dream. I was fully awake. The next day, we called a local church to come and bless the house. During the cleanse, I turned to Steve and said, "They are gone." I had a totally different feeling all of a sudden, like the heavy cold feeling I'd felt had lifted. We left straight after to run errands and came home to a completely different temperature. Before the cleanse, it felt cold, and we could run heating and the house was never warm. But suddenly it was different, and the house just felt different. My daughter's night terrors stopped completely, and I never saw another figure in the corner of my eye, or in the doorway. There were a lot of noises that we thought was the house settling in at night, but those stopped as well. After it all happened, I was talking to my mom about it, and she said that my stepsister had asked if the ghost was still in the house, but she had not wanted to mention it to me, as she thought it would scare me. Apparently her son would talk to someone, and the kettle would turn itself on, among a few other unexplainable things. As we come to the end of this edition of Midweek Mysteries, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for being here and supporting the podcast. And a special thank you goes out to Cameron, Danny, Prashant, and Kirsty for writing in and sharing their experiences with all of us. If any of you have thoughts, advice, or a similar experience that you'd like to share with one of tonight's storytellers, you can email me and I'll be sure to forward your message onto them. If you've witnessed something unexplainable and you'd like to have your story shared on the podcast, please contact me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com or visit paranormalmysteriespodcast.com and click on the Tell Your Story link. All of our contact information can be found in the show notes. Until next time, I hope you all have a safe and healthy rest of the week, and we'll see you back here on Sunday with our next full-length episode. From all of us at the Paranormal Mysteries Podcast, thank you so much for listening, and remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there and find it.